Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's AACRAO webinar, How Students Experience and Perceive Transferring Earned Credit, a National Perspective. While we give it a couple of seconds for everybody to file in, we just want to let you know that we are going to be utilizing the Zoom webinar platform today, which means that your cameras and your microphones are going to be disabled by default. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please go ahead and utilize the chat function and select all panelists, and I will go ahead and work with you directly to resolve any of those issues. And again, we'll just go ahead and give it 1 second or two to let a couple more individuals file in. And thank you again for being with us today. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to today's moderator, AACRAO's Executive Director, Michael Riley.
Thank you, Annette, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. The title today is How Students Experience and Perceive Transferring Credit and What Institutions Can Do to Help. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is brought to you with research from ACE, AACRAO, and Ithaca S&R. They've all contributed to various projects that AACRAO has been working on. Today's presentation will be delivered by Dr. Wendy Kilgore, who is AACRAO's Director of Research, and Dr. Steve Taylor, who's founder and CEO of Ed2Work and also on the ACE Transfer Task Force as a managing consultant. And we've had the pleasure of working with Steve for many years on projects when he was with ACE. As you know, AACRAO has been engaged in the work of transfer for many, many years. Prominently our transfer credit practice is used by many institutions to determine whether a credit should transfer. We've also hosted the annual transfer conference for many years. In our AACRAO research, Wendy has done numerous projects looking at the issues of transfer. We've also published a number of reports on building articulation agreements and other things. We'll share later in the program a list of resources that AACRAO has available. Their work is often attempting to look at, as they note in their report, how structures, policies, and practices enable or hinder the successful transfer of credit. It's the intersection of these things that often impact how well students do. And I should note that the student perspective is often left out of the equation. As Steve notes in one of his reports, understanding how students make decisions about the transfer process is vital to ensuring that institutions do not exacerbate existing inequalities and inefficiencies in the transfer process when implementing transfer policies and practices. So this is critical work that's taking place, and certainly none more timely given the pandemic and the possibility of increased mobility of students in and out of institutions. Next slide, please. Just want to go over some housekeeping. Participants will be muted. Please do post your questions in the Q&A tab. And if they're directed at a particular speaker, please use their name. We will answer questions at about the 45-minute mark. We'll try to stick to that. We have a lot of material to deliver. The webinar will be recorded and posted to the AACRAO website. A link to the student report is posted in the chat window and on the AACRAO website. And just fair warning, all three of us are dog people, so dog guest speaker appearances may occur unannounced. And thank you for your understanding. With that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate all of you being here today. We are all excited to share this combined information that will hopefully build a story and then tie into the recommendations that we have for practice and policy to help students in their transfer experience. We want to share student objectives and experiences at the national level. And as Mike said, the barriers to the process and the policies and practices that actually support them. And this is from the student perspective. And we also want to summarize some recently collected data from AACRAO's end on the details of institutional transfer credit policy, advising models and for transfer students, and on how credits are stranded. All of these pieces tie together, and hopefully the story evolves as we go through this presentation, and you'll see how they link together and how the recommendations tie into them. a brief show of hands, reference to the report so that Steve, Mike, and I have an idea of how to shape and spend some time on the following slides. So Annetta will pull up a poll here that you'll see. So the question is, have you read the report, How Students Experience Transferring Earned Credits? Your choices: I read all 25 pages, I glanced at the highlights, and what report? Do you mind? Take a minute for that. If your answer is what report, which it looks like we're having some folks already say that, which is fair and appropriate. So again, we have the link in the chat window to the report. But if you would like to receive all AACRAO research reports, they will be automatically sent to your email if you want to receive the AACRAO reports. From the AACRAO research page, you can sign in and opt into reaching those reports or receiving those reports. That should also be in the chat window available to you, but if it isn't yet, it will be or on the AACRAO research page. So just give another 30 seconds or so to let some more folks filter in and answer the poll here. Pretty close to 84% voted of the participants, just a couple more. Looks like we're leaning towards a glance at the highlights and what report, and that's okay. The two of you who read all 25 pages, yay, thank you. And maybe you can join in if you have comments you want to add about what you learned there. But we'll go ahead and call the poll ending here. Thank you very much, appreciate you. That helps us in our talking points. I'm going to hand it off to Steve here, who will talk about some more of the background of this project.
Great, thank you, Wendy. And again, really helpful to know how much in depth we need to go into some of this detail. So first, why did ACE and AACRAO go down this path of trying to better understand students' perceptions about transfer of credit? Well, the research shows that this is a pretty significant issue for students. They lose credits in transfer. Oftentimes, this is due to articulation agreements, which may or may not be fully enforced. So the letter and the intent, the letter and the spirit of the articulation agreement may not actually line up. And there may also be structural or institutional barriers, but more importantly, transfer students are a sizable part of the student population. And we know that right now with COVID, students are making some specific choices about their enrollment for the fall and for future terms, which means we may see that transfer number increase as a result of some of these emergent transfer patterns now. So this is an issue that we can't sweep under the rug. We need to address some of the transfer issues. We need to reduce friction in transfer and make sure that we smooth those transitions from one institution to another, since a sizable number of students, 30 to 40% based on the source and the specific point in time that you're looking at, will change institutions at least once. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Steve. Just to pause, notification the internet connection is unstable. We did not address that. If we should lose the Zoom connection, we will reconnect as soon as possible. If only one of us who's presenting loses the connection, there's a possibility that the others can jump in and start the slides over. So please be patient if we have Zoom capacity issues here. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, Steve,
of that, most institutions who are now back online are probably using Zoom or a similar platform, so that may lead to some of the hiccups here, but we will press on. All right, so what do we know here about transfer of credit specifically and how students are moving to and through institutions? We know very basic level information about transfer students, and oftentimes this information comes from a snapshot in time or a look back in time. So if we think about the GAO report, Government Accountability Office report in 2017, they were using BPS study data from the early 2000s, again, looking back in time at a specific group of students who transferred. And the important thing to note about some of these earlier studies looking at the transfer student experience or transfer of credit is that there is a contextual factor that is very important, but that is missing from those data. And so something we wanted to start to surface in this current study, but also in some future studies, is really pulling those contextual factors out. I think on the next slide, we've got some of these contextual factors here. So if we can move on. Okay. So on this sort of background here, when we look at the national data that exists on transcripts to better understand how students move to and through institutions and what that looks like, again, we're looking largely at bachelor's and beyond or BPS studies, BPS data to understand that transfer phenomenon. But again, we lack how students are actually moving through that transfer funnel. So what we know is students have specific course taking choices. They specifically intend to have credits transfer or not transfer based on personal circumstances, other life factors, and none of that context shows up in the data that exists based on these other data sources. So we may be able to tell in a particular GAO report, for example, using data from the early 2000s with a snapshot in time, back in time, that based on a review of transcripts without any context, that a certain percentage of transfer credits move over from one institution to another, but there's a big gap in that data because we, again, don't know if students were satisfied with credits that did or did not transfer. We don't know why some of those credits did or did not transfer, which policies came into play that impacted that credit transfer. So all of that is important to note when we think about the current data that exists on transfer. But at the end of the day, it still means that we need to focus on reducing that friction, smoothing those pathways, making sure that we're more transparent in terms of how students utilize or consume information about transfer of credit and move through those pathways. And to that end, ACE, the American Council on Education, created this National Task Force on Transfer of Credit. This is a group of 28 college and university presidents, pretty representative of higher ed across the country, executives from key higher ed associations, including Mike Riley, who's on this webinar today, to really understand from an institutional perspective how institutions can smooth those transitions for students. So we're taking a look at transfer of credit from both sort of the macro perspective, what's happening in the nation, what is the data showing us, where are the gaps, but also from a student perspective, how are they experiencing transfer? Where are credits being lost in that funnel? So that as a task force, we can work with other higher ed associations, work with institutions on putting forward a set of recommendations to, as Ted Mitchell, the president of ACE says, reduce that friction. Next slide, please. All right, so just a quick snapshot for you. In any study, you've got to place some guardrails around the study so that we don't experience any of that sort of scope creep. In the present study that ACE and AACRAO conducted, we wanted to focus specifically on students who had transferred from at least one institution to another. This was a national sample of about, I think we ended up having 1,003 students. We needed, again, to place some guardrails, so we focused on domestic students only. And these are self-reported data, so students who self-identified as domestic students, currently enrolled in only one institution. So if somebody was enrolled at a community college, simultaneously enrolled at a four-year institution, and they were using that blend or mix of institutions to maybe fill in some gaps, they were not included in the study. We were making sure that we were looking specifically at students who were already enrolled in post-secondary education. They may have used dual credit at some point in that transfer funnel, but they were not currently high school students, maybe benefiting from dual credit. And again, wanted to get a pretty good representative sample of the national higher education landscape. So we had a pretty good mix of public, private, and 2-year and 4-year institutions. And it is worth noting from a research perspective that the survey was incentivized. Next slide, please. All right, and then in terms of things that we were looking at specifically and what we wanted to learn, we really wanted to look at that holistic transfer experience. So how students brought in or thought about receiving credit for dual credit in high school, non-institutional learning such as ACE's military evaluations for credit equivalent learning or training. We wanted to look at institutions and how transfer credit sort of played from transferring from one institution, so a sending institution to a receiving institution, but also look at how transfer credit applied within a similar institution. So if you're at an institution, you've changed majors, new degree audit means that your credits need to be evaluated again, looking at factors such as that. Ultimately, what we found in looking at these questions and these key data points in this current survey, this led us to think about, again, providing that additional context to marry with the student responses and their perceptions of transfer of credit to see if what students perceive about their transfer of credit experience lines up with what actually happens. So ACE and AACRAO, this is a slight preview, are currently conducting a study looking at the transcripts for a number of students from a certain segment of ACE's transfer task force institutions to see exactly how transfer of credit is occurring between institutions and how institutional policies and practices around advising as well as transfer of credit impact the actual credits that are awarded during transfer. And again, that was an outcome of this present study where there was definitely an interest among task force members, AACRAO and ACE, to better understand the difference or the similarities between how students perceive that experience and then the actual experience based on the transcript level data for current students. And next slide. Wendy, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. And we're going to try to be mindful of we are going to be mindful of our time here. So some of the slides that we cover in terms of study results will be briefer than others so that we can have some room for Q&A at the end. So we may skim over a few of these slides, but just want to bring them to your attention. Again, all the information is in the report. We did an institutional practice and policy survey as well, a larger one to AACRAO members for U.S. institutions serving undergraduate students, mix of public and private, of size and type. It included 2 parts. The first part, sponsored by Ithaca S&R, was about practices and policies contributing to stranded credits. And stranded credits refers to the accumulated credits for which a student is unable to obtain an official transcript due to an administrative hold. And why, you may ask, is that included in this transfer practice webinar? It's because it's part of it. If a student is unable to get access to their credits, then they can't transfer them. So it's part of this overall puzzle, and that's one of the reasons why we're studying this, and so is Ithaca S&R. We asked questions about why they're held, whether or not they're held for a specific dollar amount, if there are debt elimination and debt forgiveness practices, and the ability to estimate with data what percentage of their population is being impacted. The second part of that survey of institutional surveys we did recently was optional. So folks could end at stranded credits or continue on, but that was based upon a deeper dive we did with the ACE task force members, asking institutions about a lot of details around their transfer credit policies and practices. A deep dive into them, and asking also about advising models for transfer students because of the information we learned from the student survey, which we will highlight. So the student experiences, here's what they said. The initial request for transfer credit, remember this is 1,003 students, 96% are saying that they had all of their previous transcripts sent to the new institution. Some of them chose not to send all of them. So there's part of the lost credits. And when you look at just the transcript data in national samples, it doesn't tell you whether or not a student requested the transcript be sent. 23% of this sample actually had to ask for the credits to be evaluated. And that is more predominant among private institutions. We had a very small sample of military students. Of them, 13 asked that their joint transcript students, of the 27 to be, so again, a population that didn't ask for it to be sent. And so there's already the first part of the funnel of how possibly credits can be lost in transfer. We asked whether the students, again, self-reported data, whether all of their credit was earned in transfer or some. And this was not differentiated by applied, we did not differentiate that from awarded, as in they were given the credit, whether or not it subsequently applied was not differentiated. But the good news is 56%, more than half, report in that large sample that all of their earned credit transferred for them to their next institution. So this is not as bleak of perspective as some of the other data out there that looks at just some transcript information. 41% reported that some of the credit transferred, the remaining reported that none. And that on the diagram to the right, that is differentiated, some, all, or none by institution type. It was that private institution students that transfer to private are less likely to report that all of their credits transferred and more likely to report that none. So that's one of the key points that has come out in this and in other studies, that there is some difference among institutional types in transfer. We did ask the students to self-report how the awarded credit was applied. We just wanted to get an idea of whether or not they really fell into the general education requirements, or they were not sure, or electives, or whether they applied to the major. Pretty similar results between public and private institutions in this sample. As you can see, the majority applied by self-reported to the general education requirements. But a fair percentage also applied to their major, so that's good. It meant that they were bringing some things in that helped them move forward in their major components. We do have that small percentage, though, that don't know how it was applied, and that leads to part of our recommendations section. This is a lot of data on this slide, and it's not meant for you to digest it in its entirety because it is in the report, but we listed a lot of choices, and they could pick from any of these multiple options what they believe their known reasons were for credits lost in transfer. And I want to bring your attention to a few of these things. The first is the aspect of academic advising resources. They should not be discounted as a contributing factor to credit loss. So these folks, some of them are saying they self-advised, or they felt they were misadvised, or that the degree checklist was hard to understand, or they changed their catalog of record. And those things in and of themselves can ultimately result in them not getting as many credits as they thought they should have been awarded when they transferred. So advising is starting to pop up as this idea of importance. To that, as Steve alluded to, with the deep dive of the data in the national sense doesn't really talk about these personal choices, because we don't know that if you don't talk to the students. There are a number of red arrows here, and they are all personal choices. So they major exploration, personal interest, change major, or a decision about dual enrollment when they enrolled in high school. And the question I always ask myself, how does a sophomore or junior in high school know exactly what major they're going to apply to, or what program of study in college to know which dual enrollment courses they should take part in, especially when those dual enrollment courses do double dipping, high school graduation and otherwise. So they may just take dual enrollment just because it was presented to them, and not necessarily because they believe it's going to be applied to their degrees of study later on. So that's an important point here. How many red arrows about personal choices, and the percentage of them that evolve in students understanding why they didn't earn all of their credit in transfer. It was not awarded. The national study, 2020, was 1,000+ students. And then we also, in 2019, did a study with the University of Arizona. It included many years of their transfer students, and more than 1,000 students there as well. And we wanted to see, when we reproduced this study at the national level, whether or not the single institution results matched. And this, I mean, if you look at these samples, the percentages are pretty darn close along several of these categories. And when I saw that and put that together, it's, in other words, data nerds rejoice, because I was super excited. Here's my reaction to this. It shows that we are on the right path in examining, or I believe it does, that in examining what we are to try to get a deeper understanding of why students lose credits in transfer. Students were generally happy with the resources available from both the institution they were transferring from and the institutions they were transferring to. This one says that their current institution provided clear information about transfer, but that also applied to those, the information they received from the institution they transferred from. So generally, most were happy. They got resources available to me, they had access to them, and it helped them move forward. Among those that didn't transfer all credits, we're calling that lost credits. So they earned more than were awarded or applied. They were asked whether or not they were pleased or not on a scale, and 30% selected they were generally pleased, and they expected there to be some credits earned that would not transfer. That kind of goes back to that personal choice thing, and perhaps grade earned and other factors, but it did not come as a surprise, and they were generally pleased with it. It wasn't that big of a deal. Another 29% said they were neither pleased nor displeased, so they were neutral about it. They did expect that there would be credits that earned that would not transfer. The remaining percentage, so that's less than half, who did not transfer all the credits, were either slightly displeased or really displeased, and they were more upset about it. And that's the population that we're trying to find solutions for predominantly. I mean, we don't want anybody to lose credits that they think they should earn credits for, but the focus should be on those who are not understanding why and are bothered by it, you know, because it's not tied to something they expected to have happen. 43%, this was one of those, and the picture of the girl in the background is like, I thought was perfect for this, who did not transfer all of their credits, did not know why. That is a gap in information. Their perception was they had no idea why some of their earned credits were left on the table. And that stood out to both me and Steve and others when we looked at this data. Steve, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would just say from an ACE task force perspective, transparency is key. And this data point here really just hits home that we, and I say the collective we as institutions in higher ed, we really owe it to our students to do a better job of us telling them proactively why credits did or did not transfer, rather than making this transparency aspect incumbent upon learners asking us why credits didn't transfer. So it's really just kind of changing the paradigm, and as institutions or registrar's offices or faculty are making determinations about whether or not credits will or will not transfer, making sure that communicating and back to students that feedback loop is built in is a really important part of the funnel, rather than putting the onus on students to find out why and do that investigating to figure out why our policies limited their credit transfer.
Thank you, Steve. Again, a very data-rich slide here. So it's a lot of information to process in a short period of time. But we asked what could have helped. The dark green are the folks who were somewhat displeased, and the gray is extremely displeased in the credits that they lost. What comes up again is dual enrollment at the top there, and advising at the institution to which they transferred from, and advising at the current institution. So if you think about what's happening here, we have this pattern, advising, and starting to emerge is dual enrollment as well. Other factors are playing in part here, but it was important to ask those who were unhappy what they believe could have helped them. And to have advising pop up at the top is pretty important. We also asked them all what the most useful resources were to them. And so we had this alignment between those who were not happy said advising could have been better, and those who were happy said that advising was the most helpful. both at the high school and, I mean, all three places, the high school and when they transferred from and at their current institution. So again, floating to the top, advising. And then we have the institution's website, and it goes down from there. They learn from family members, other students, and as you can see, a theme is emerging. We wanted to know also where excess credit was earned. So when they graduated, when they anticipated graduating, if they were going to have excess credit, and this ties back to the U of A study, we studied that. Where was the extra credit when they graduated? The more than 124, for example, semester credit hours. If you look at this, they earned some of them, the columns are all credits transferred, some credits transferred, and none. And they had excess credits from the current institution when they're about to graduate and from the transfer institution for a lot of them. That's the top row there. So even though we talk about credits lost in transfer and excess credits, it also applies when they go to their current institution, the new one. And we learned out in the U of A study as well, there was virtually no difference between the students who started at the University of Arizona and never transferred and those who started at another institution and went to the U of A in terms of the number of credits that were above and beyond what was required to graduate. So that is another study available on the AACRAO research site, but it points to that there are virtually no difference in the number of excess credits earned at graduation between those who transferred and those who started as direct entry students in that study. And that kind of pulls out here with this national sample as well. The student data is rich, but the takeaways are most student feels that their transfer institution and current institution have good resources. More than half were successful in transferring all of their credits. 43% of those who didn't transfer all didn't have any idea why the credits didn't transfer, so we're not communicating that to them, or they do not believe we are. Academic advising is important, and dual enrollment has a part in the story for almost a third of the students in this national sample who lost credit. So dual enrollment pops up there as important as well. We started to examine a number of policies and practice factors that may influence how credit is awarded and applied. And this is not a complete listing on this slide at all. This is just, but the levels of earned credit, grade earned, age of credit, direct equivalency, whether or not the credit was earned while they were in high school, a lack of faculty buy-in. There are a number of things, and this is just a small sample to give you an idea of the things that students kind of have to understand or should understand about what factors influence whether the credit will transfer. So the institutional results, full report is forthcoming when I have a chance to write that in the next few weeks. We will produce the entire set of results, but there's a sampling of it here. And again, this is back to that AACRAO report, a survey that had stranded credits and the policies for transfer evaluation. Ithaca SNR report will be released at the end of September. Our combined report on stranded credits will be reported. And this part of the research was sponsored by Ithaca SNR. So we found that 95% withhold an official transcript for one or more reasons. That's probably not surprising to most. Among those that withhold for official transcript, 96% of them do for owing money. The rather surprising amount was that of those, more than half for a balance of less than $25 owed. So they will withhold an official transcript from a student if the student owes less than $25. Most don't have a debt forgiveness practice, and 3/4, also most, don't have a debt elimination practice. And 11% only notify students of a transcript hold when they request a transcript. So there's a small population of students who have no idea they have a transcript hold until they go and request one. The report will line up the other reasons why students are, or how other reasons how students are notified, and the other reasons why holds are applied. They're just not addressed here in this webinar. On the policy section, we learned that 13% of transfer students are never required to meet with an academic advisor. We also learned that sometimes they're required to meet with an academic advisor before they register, or not until after they register at their new institution. Sometimes they're not required to register until the next semester. So we have a population of students who actually do not meet with an academic advisor before they register at the new institution for one reason or another. Whether or not that contributes to their credits that transferred depends probably on the timing of when that advising takes place. While they're still enrolled at the other institution, you know, a really strong partnership or not. We do not know that detail yet. We asked for primary responsibility of first-term advising. We're trying to get the idea of whether or not that plays into whether or not, what percentage of credits transfer. The majority have professional academic advisors, and these are all that apply, so they may overlap. They also have faculty advisors. Some do it through admissions counseling. Some have transfer-specific professional staff as well, and very few use peer advisors. But again, trying to get an understanding of how advising might play into the effectiveness of transfer credit evaluation. This is big font on purpose. Transfer credit evaluation practice and policy is highly variable from institution to institution. That is probably already known. People are maybe nodding their head about it, but just how varied became quite clear with this sample of several hundred institutions. And I'll dive into that in a little bit, but want to let Steve comment here as well.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, the caveat here is we recognize among the thousands of higher ed institutions that exist in the country, each institution has its own mission, vision, a specific segment of the population that it serves. So we respect that institutional autonomy, and we recognize the need to have some variability between policies at institutions that align with their mission and the population served. But again, this is really where that transparency aspect comes to bear, that while we have variable policies at these institutions, we need to be extremely transparent and make it very easy for students or learners to digest this information and make sense out of it, so that they can move to and through these institutions seamlessly. So that's just the caveat. You know, both AC and AACRAO represent, we're member organizations, we represent a broad segment of institutions. Again, institutional autonomy key, but that institutional autonomy and variability shouldn't negatively impact students.
Thank you, Steve. So the reason we include both policy and practice is because you probably, most institutions, well, they're required if you're Title IV eligible, to post their transfer policies, to make those available. But there's practices. So there's the underlying practices, that's all the nuance that we know that if it's for example, a computer science class that's older than 20 years, we no longer accept that, but that's just for computer sciences, or there's little variances in practices, which is probably not going to be outlined in the policy. So the survey contained 36 different policies and practices to choose from. Of those, all of them, all 36 were selected by one or more institution. So that is quite the collection of policies and practices. All of them were selected by one or more institutions. For many of these options, they were allowed to add please describe. So there is even further variance. So there would have been a descriptive summary that the number of credits that are applicable to a major is fixed, for example, just as an idea. And the please describe, they may have said, but that only applies to these types of majors under these conditions for these students. And that kind of variance, that even further nuance, was there. And of those, 6% also said there's other practice not listed in those 36s. That's 36 that we included. That was quite surprising to me when I looked at the fact that all institutions selected one or more of the 30, that all or more were selected by one or more, surprised me. That we had that much variance in practice and policy. So pretty data-rich slide here again, and we are about 20 minutes out from the end, so I will not go into it in much detail, but some of the limitations include more than half on the number of transfer credits. About a quarter have age limitation. more than a third won't accept if it's awarded based upon an advanced placement test scores. Some limit the number, 30% that limit the number applied to the major. So there's all kinds of things that contribute to this lost credit that students may or may not understand, and that GAO report and others can't capture because they don't understand the applicability of these policies and practices and limiting the applicability of awarding credit. Some more, we have 23% only apply credits to the major at the time of admission, even if there are more eligible credits. And 28% of those require a student to request a reevaluation if he changes major. So some of this falls on the student. If they don't apply all the credits to all possible credits, award them. That's the language I'm going to use. Awarding means they say, we have an equivalency or we're willing to give an equivalency. Whether or not that applies is different. But up front, they will say, here's all of these that are awarded, and then they can pick and choose as they change majors, if they change majors, to reapply those awarded credits. And the extra ones fall out and they end up not being used in the end. But 23% only apply to the major at the time of admission. 33%, rather surprising, do not have articulation rules built in the SIS. By that I mean that each decision for transfer equivalency is made manually each time. Even if the course is the same over and over from the same institution, it is a human being that is making that decision each time rather than a machine making the decision for you. 38% will articulate all possible credits and apply limits at the program level. That's a very good practice. But only 63% share a detailed report with students. That lines up. Remember, we had 46% of students reporting that they don't know why their credits transfer. The institution ties that pretty darn closely. This is a different sample of institutions, but 63% has that gap of 37 there, you know, lines up a little bit with what the students are saying. That is a lot of data. And how that came together for us here at AACRAO was a set of recommendations on communication, advising, credit evaluation, and transcript hold practices. All of the recommendations included in this report are from AACRAO. Recommendations from the ACE task force will be out in March of 2021. But Steve and I have discussed these recommendations. These won't come as a surprise to him. But these recommendations for communicating decisions with students, these are what we think, based upon all this data coming together, that institutions should all engage in. Communicate clearly to all transfer students how their credits were awarded and how they will be applied to the major. So we had that differentiation. They don't know why they were lost, and some did not know how they were applied to their program of study or major. Communicate why they're not. Have an appeal policy in place for transfer credit evaluation decisions and make that widely available to students that they understand it. This is a big one and it's hard to maintain, but create, use, and maintain a fully automated, internally trusted degree audit system visible to students, staff, and advising that supports what-if major change analyses. This is a hard one. Very few institutions, as a percentage of all institutions, have one that they truly trust, that they will run and say, this is accurate, it always is accurate, and we maintain it, and everybody agrees to it. So this is probably one of the larger challenges that institutions face right now in terms of this transfer advising technology component, is a degree audit system that's fully trusted. Recommendations for advising include coordinating with local high school advisors more closely around dual enrollment. So perhaps letting the students understand how and if dual enrollment will be accepted and applied. And build strong advising partnerships with your primary transfer institutions. That sort of seems to make sense here, since students are saying advising is both good and bad, and helpful and not helpful. We'd like to encourage early and regular advising engagements with students who intend to transfer, and require that all new transfer students meet with an academic advisor after their credits have been evaluated and before registration. Automatically evaluate, this is credit evaluation guidance, automatically evaluate incoming transcripts for credit, and do so as soon as the transcript is received, because the timely evaluation is important. Alluded to the importance of evaluating the transcript for all possible credit to support the what if major changes or actual changes in majors. So students, we know about 30%, varying plus or minus a little bit, students will change major from the time they're admitted to the time they graduate at least once, if not more. If the earned credit is not fully awarded and applied, the student then has to understand all the processes to go around and find out how or what credits were left before and ask for them to be reevaluated or ask for a degree audit to be reconfigured. And that is a lot to place on a student who is navigating all these other things in the institution, especially for the more vulnerable students who do not have the cultural capital of friends and or family who have gone through college to understand all of these things about the processes and procedures. So ideally, evaluate all possible credits available to them, and build and use and maintain automated articulation rules to enable consistent, timely credit evaluation for your primary transfer institutions. So if you can identify where about 80% of your transfer students come from, if you're able to do that, that's where ideally you would build your transfer articulation rules and maintain them. I accept electronic transcripts and in machine readable format so the decisions are made automated without staff needing to enter data from a PDF transcript. This is one of the things that came up in our COVID studies, that folks were trying to switch to these machine readable transcripts in a short notice because they were no longer in the office to accept paper transcripts. But the automated articulation rules and automated decisions speed up this process a lot and can communicate things back to students, transfer students, in a much more rapid fashion. And then finally, simplifying the transfer evaluation policy and practice to maximizing awarding credit when another institution has already assessed that credit was earned. So this is the PLA, the dual enrollment, any other way credits are awarded, and trying to get that 36 different policies and procedures nuances down to something that both the institution truly understands and embraces internally, that tries to maximize the awarding of credit, and that can be then communicated to students with the context that Steve mentioned, that's your culture and your mission of your institution. But simplifying it would be a good thing. Transcript hold practices. We should reconsider whether or not the transcript is held for an outstanding balance of $25 or less. Instead, establish an internal fund to eliminate these small debts if at all possible. Because the $25 is pretty small for a lot of people, but for some students, again, the most vulnerable, that actually might be something that's very hard for them to overcome. And if we can establish internal funds to eliminate them, that would be helpful. Develop and widely share written policies specifying the circumstances under which an official transcript will not be released, and see that everybody agrees to them. When you see the report on stranded credits, there are a number of reasons why they're held, not just for balances, but a lot of reasons why transcripts are held. And allow these to be, information to be disseminated and how they can be avoided. So students should understand how to avoid these circumstances. Provide an avenue for appeal. Allow students during this time that they have a transcript hold access to their unofficial transcript, and release official transcripts to a prospective or current employer for an employment-related action, if an employment-related action is tied to the receipt of an official transcript. So even if it's being held, our recommendation is that for the purposes of an employment-related action, that you go ahead and release that official transcript for that singular purpose. Finally, to quote Tolkien, "Not all those who wander are lost." I want to bring us back to the idea that student course-taking choices related to career and or major exploration, personal enrichment, or dual enrollment in high school maybe contribute to lost credits, but still have value to the student. We are not likely to reach a point where all credits for all students are always transferred, because they are these things that students do and will continue to do, and through their process of going through college, that will make some of them not transfer. We just want to make sure that they understand that, and that these things are actually okay. It's okay for them to do personal enrichment and exploration and all those things, but that they may contribute to credits that are lost. Steve, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just say, in addition to recognizing the personal choice and course-taking behaviors aspect, Simply providing elective credit for everything that a student brings in is not always helpful to that student. In my experience working with institutions and working at institutions in Texas, there are certain policies that, credit policies that if a student earns 150% of credits toward a degree, that has financial implications on state subsidies for tuition. And so we just want to be mindful of both understanding some of the variables that impact whether or not credits should transfer, but also granting excess credit and the potential negative implications that that may have on students' financial aid or other factors that would impact their ability to complete a degree.
Thank you. Quick slide. This will be available to you through the slide to the slide deck, but also we have lots of AACRAO related resources to transfer. Mike mentioned them, some of them at the beginning. They're all listed here. I won't read them to you because I want to make sure we give a chance to do any questions. So I'm handing it back over to Mike to address any Q&A we may have.
Thank you, Wendy and Steve. A lot of great information there on multiple topics, certainly from the transfer student process, but also some important information about stranded credits, which had a couple folks comment that that's an important issue. I'm glad we're addressing it. Wendy, can you speak a little bit to the nature of automatic nature of articulations? Are you referring to a transfer credit blocks built out in the SAS that make for a smooth articulation process? When you say automating the process, what are you speaking to specifically?
Sure, absolutely. In the truly automated fashion, there are institutions that are able to receive transcripts from their primary feeder institutions in a machine readable format, and there are a number of those. So the transcripts themselves come in and are read nightly or every couple of hours or whatever process is set up at the institution. That machine readable data is read and evaluated, and the articulation rules, so the ones that you've said, these are course equivalencies and grade equivalencies and all the rules that are built in the SIS are applied to those machine readable transcripts, and the equivalency decision is made by the student information system. It is not made by a person. It's automatic. It's posted to the student's transcript. It can then subsequently also automatically be triggered to send an email or any other communication to a student, and it's instantaneous. So from the time you receive the transcript to the time the student receives an evaluation of those credits can be a couple of hours, depending on the timing of the processes that are executed in the system. This eliminates the manual processes of trying to read PDF transcripts, trying to enter that data, which would be the equivalent of paper. Basically, you put it in front of you, you type the questions in, and you make the classes in, and you make the articulation decisions. That's what an automated system does. And those systems are sophisticated enough that they will spit out the courses. Spit out, that's a technical term. They will set aside an exception report for each student that says, we don't have any equivalencies for these courses, and those are the ones that the institution would have to make decisions on manually. But think about the idea model. You have 80% feeder, you have a lot of equivalency decisions made, your articulation decisions are rapid in that model, and some institutions are doing that very well. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Seth Kamen raises a question here. Hello, Seth. The issue of requiring all official transcripts for the release of financial aid. Says, can AACRAO help us interpret the Department of Ed policy and establish a practice? I'll be honest, in my previous work in admissions and working with transfer, we did require all transcripts before we could complete someone's admissions. And you see, at least in the survey, that there are a number of students that did not send all transcripts to institutions. So obviously some institutions proceeded with the admissions process without a full set of transcripts. So I think that is something that we need to look at, because I have been under the impression that we did have to make all official transcripts available, which caused problems for students who had debts to previous institutions. So I think that's something to look at. Wendy or Steve, do you have any comments on that?
I do, Mike. We actually, that survey on the policy and practices asks institutions to report what they do if a student does not submit all transcripts. And when that report is released, it will talk a bit about the various practices that they either put a hold on the student or stop the admissions decision or require it for the next registration cycle or there's several permutations on that. So we will at least understand the permutations of practice and policy, but yet how to address that when students are self-reporting that they aren't is a different question, I think.
Okay. We have an international question here. Asks, what is the ideal decision about transcripts from conflict in undeveloped countries that are not automated or accredited? I wonder if Annetta, who happens to be, helping us facilitate, who happens to be an expert in this topic, has any thoughts on that.
Hi, sure, Mike, no problem. Basically, when we have individuals who are coming from regions that have been in conflict or environmental crisis and are not able to get their transcripts, AACRAO does actually have a lot of research and recommendations for that. And what I will go ahead and do is share with the group the link where we have that guidance from the website.
Thank you. There's a question about whether or not this points that most of our transfer credit policies align with our accrediting bodies' policies. Does the ACE task force plan to look at any of the accrediting commission's requirements, or have they already? Steve, do you know whether they're formally going to look at that?
So that's something that we're actually looking at right now in terms of how regional accreditation and/or national accreditation may impact what institutions can and cannot do in terms of easing that transfer funnel. So that is something that's on our radar to include in the final report, which will come out most likely in March 2021. But that is definitely on the table and in the deliberations among the task force members.
Thank you.
And it's probably worth noting too that there is representation from one of the regional accreditors on the task force as an ex officio member.
There's a question here about PLA and the issue of awarding credit where another institution has already assessed that credit was earned, noting that it could be problematic if your institution has different policies about that. That's one of the issues that we've discovered in our research, is that there's a high percentage of institutions that do not accept prior learning assessments from the previous institution. And in fact, I think there's still 2 regional accreditors that limit the percentage of credits that can be awarded to a degree through PLA. So I think it's a difficult question, one that, AACRAO has sort of towed the line on not recommending direct transcripting of PLA credits. But Wendy, maybe you can talk about this, that we've been looking at this a little bit differently lately.
Mike, we actually have a report on PLA practices that was one we did a few years ago, but also on the AACRAO research page is the one we did with the WICHE, and that's actually where I would send folks, is to the WICHE resources on their PLA. They did a large multi-paper insights over the course of almost a year, and are releasing those reports one at a time, and have a resource page. Again, that's WICHE, W-I-C-H-E, and included in there are a number of recommendations on how to address these kind of things around PLA and transfer. Because as Mike noted, our data shows that 65% of institutions do not accept PLA and transfer if the receiving institution is able to identify that that credit was earned by a PLA on the transcript. So we need to be clear here. Sometimes you cannot tell that PLA was earned on the transcript as prior learning assessment, because the institution that awarded it is actually awarding it as course equivalency. And so it looks like their institution's equivalent course and cannot be differentiated. So that 65% is among those who can tell the difference. So we have multiple reports on that on our research page, and you can search by keyword PLA, but the accurate up-to-date stuff right now is really on WICHE. That's the big resource for you right now. The Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education Prior Learning Assessment Task Force.
Okay, thank you. I think we've run out of time now. I want to thank Wendy Kilgore and Steve Taylor for their great information. Thank all of you for your participation, and a reminder that the webinar was recorded if you want to go back through and look at any of the information. And we thank you and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.